Hello everyone, welcome to this PIR live event brought to you by Partners in Research and the Ontario Agri-food Education Organization. Our guest today for this special Canadian Agricultural Literacy Week live event is Nancy Tout, Head of Regulatory and Biological Assessment for Syngenta Canada Inc., an agribusiness committed to sustainable agriculture, farming with future generations in mind. And joining us, Catherine Raining, the Teacher Ambassador Program Coordinator for Ontario Agri-food Education.
Thank you. And for those of you who don't know who are just joining us on live stream today, Ontario Agri-food Education works with our Teacher Ambassador program. It's our biggest program. And we look to educate classrooms on agri-food topics using our free grade 7 to 12 lessons. And we're really happy to be here today. We think it's going to be a great event, so thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. My name is Brent Peltola. I am the Director of Programs for Partners in Research. Today we are going to explore biotechnology, GMOs, and careers in agriculture with Nancy in today's discussion and Q&A. But before we get started, I'd like to make a couple of announcements and thank yous. So I'd like to offer a special thank you to Mr. Guyich and his grade 11 class here at Centennial College Collegiate Institute in Guelph for providing us with a home base for today's live event. Thank you, guys. As well as Mrs. Cappadocia's grade 11 class joining our video conference from North Bay today. It's great to have you with us too. Thank you. I'd also like to welcome all of our viewers watching the live stream. It's great to have you with us today. For those watching on the live stream, remember that you can tweet your questions using the Canadian Agriculture Literacy Week hashtag CALW15 throughout this live event. If there's room in your tweet, please include your name, city, school, etc., so that we can give you a shout out. I look forward to getting some questions in a moment, but first of all, I'll turn it over to Nancy. Thank you for joining us today. So to kick it off, Nancy, if you can tell us a little bit about Syngenta and the work that you do in biotechnology.
Great. Well, welcome everyone, and apology to the classroom behind me. But really, I want to add my thank you and shout out to the teachers who have joined us today and agreed to let agriculture into their classrooms. I know agriculture fits with the Ontario curriculum, so I really want to thank you for allowing us to come into the classroom to talk about very current information on agriculture, very factual-based information on agriculture. I also just want to briefly say that my perspective of agriculture may be a little bit different than your perspective. So your perspective when I say the word agriculture may be when you go to the grocery store and you buy your food. It may be the garden in your backyard. It may be some people have relatives that do farm. My perspective of agriculture that I'll be talking about today is very much global. It's about feeding a hungry population. We're going to have 9 billion people on this planet by 2050. So we currently have about just over 7 billion people. So how many of you think about agriculture, thinking about feeding 9 billion people by 2050? Probably not a lot of you. But that's something that myself and people in Syngenta and other companies are thinking about each and every day. So next slide, if we just talk a bit about they asked me to sort of talk about, sorry, we're just going to get the slide deck up here. Talk about a bit about my career path in agriculture. So, and the reason we wanted to do that, because for every graduate out there, there's about 3 or 4 different opportunities in agriculture for people to come into. And I don't think people think about that. I'm not sure if your guidance counselors that you talk to, bring up agriculture, but wanted to say that agriculture is an exciting career. I've been happy to be involved in agriculture for the past 16 years. So I talk about agriculture as being almost the forgotten industry within life sciences. And I think that's because people when they think of agriculture, they really think about farming. And they say, well, I don't really want to be a farmer. What can I do in agriculture? So hopefully some of the things that I talked to you today about is there's a big role that science and technology can play in agriculture. In fact, I didn't fall in love with science really until my grade 13 year in high school. I had a fabulous teacher in biology, which I know all of you folks have as well. And when I left to go away to university, and I went to Wilfrid Laurier University, I went off thinking I'm going to find the cure for cancer. And that was sort of my viewpoint, is that I wanted to work in sort of the medical field and medical research. But I did a very general biology degree, which I must say served me really, really well. I learned a little bit about plants. I learned a little bit about animals, taxonomy, chemistry, physics, biology, all those things gave me a very general degree. And I know these days there's lots of very fancy degrees that you can get in sciences, but that has really served me well. I went on to do a PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Guelph, where I worked on a disease known as cystic fibrosis. And then I went on and did a couple years in environmental biology at University of Guelph, doing a postdoctoral fellowship where the marriage of agriculture and medicine came into play. And that's where I was cloning, and my first play into biotechnology was cloning antibodies into plants. And those plants then could be used for medicine. So it was very, very interesting. So I'm hoping that you think about agriculture. So I'm sure many of you came in today thinking, I don't know anything about biotechnology. So it's my time to ask you a few questions first. You're going to get your opportunity to fire them back at me. But what is biotechnology in its basic form? And again, if you split apart that word, it's really biology, and technology or tools. So it's really a product that comes from a live organism. So if you think about biotechnology in those terms, what are some examples of biotechnology that you can maybe think of? I'm hoping beer and wine are the ones that are familiar to you all, but certainly beer and wine come from the use of live organisms, yeast, and certainly bread as well. But maybe one that's maybe more familiar to you, something that you put on what's very much a staple on our burgers in our house in the summertime, cheese. And cheese is produced through biotechnology. And that's because to be able to convert milk into cheese, you need a bit of a curdling process, and you need something called rennet. And you can only get rennet from the stomachs of calves. So they continued to take rennet back in the old days from the stomachs of cows. And then obviously with the big animal rights movement and things, and the demand for cheese obviously going up in our diets, they look for alternate sources to be able to deliver that critical enzyme to produce cheese. And they did that by cloning that gene into bacteria and then mass producing it. But I'm curious if anybody knows about the first product of modern day biotechnology, because there were some important scientific discoveries around the 50s, one of them being Gregor Mendel, what we call the father of heredity. He was actually a plant scientist, a plant breeder who was working on peas at the time. And we also had an important discovery, Watson and Crick, who discovered DNA. And I'm looking at Mr. Geitch's beautiful DNA molecules sitting up here in his classroom. And so DNA being, the blueprint of life. And that really opened up the field of what I call modern biotechnology. So I'm curious if anybody knows about the first product of modern biotechnology. It's pretty, close to my heart, and it's insulin. My son is type 1 diabetic and wouldn't be alive today without the use of modern day biotechnology. Again, insulin they used to get from dogs and cows and pigs. They used to take it out and purify it and then inject it into humans. But again, as the demand for insulin rose and the animal rights movement, we looked for alternate ways, scientists looked for alternate ways to then clone that gene for insulin once it was discovered, put it into a simple bacteria like E. coli, and then purify that insulin. So what a wonderful discovery of biotechnology. Next slide. So then, I'm going to be talking, though, really about genetically modified organisms, or in plant agriculture, biotechnology really means the process then of taking a gene, making a copy, and putting it into another plant organism and then using that in another plant. So the result then, what we have is a genetically modified organism. Next slide. And you may hear a lot of different terms for biotechnology, GMOs, and things like that. So GMO, genetic modification, biotechnology, biotech seeds, genetic engineering, it all means the same thing from a plant biotechnology perspective. It means that a change has been made to the DNA of an organism. Next slide. So how old is biotechnology? Because you hear a fancy term like biotechnology and you think, you know what? That's something that's pretty new. Well, in fact, biotechnology has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And why is that? Because farmers back then, and they'd see a particular plant that resisted disease or resisted an insect, and they'd save that seed. And then they'd do some crosses between different plants, right? So they did some cross-pollination with the plants and found out that they were able to develop better species of plants that were better adapted to the conditions at the time. So that's where plant breeders and researchers then, they seek out those additional means and looked at the science. And then we have the 50s coming up, and of course those incredible discoveries that were made by Mendel and Watson and Crick. And all of a sudden we have more information about the DNA of plants. So really in the 80s then, that's when biotechnology really took off. There was very precise ways of taking a gene that they knew because of the sequencing the whole genome of the plants, and they could take those genes and transfer them into other plants to get the desirable traits. But before that time, there was genetic mixing from cross-pollination and the breeding of plants. I have a wheat breeder on my team that works in Western Canada, and he will walk fields upon fields upon fields looking for that best wheat that's going to produce the best bread, the best pasta. And he will walk those fields day and night to find that one particular plant that looks good. And then he'll save that seed and then make it cross with another one that had a particularly good yield or a good disease resistance package with it. But today, biotechnology, modern day biotechnology plants is really about using very precise information then and transferring that into a plant. So it's a more precise way, but it's really a mixing up of the genetic information. Next slide. So this is just a good example that biotechnology has been around for thousands and thousands of years. So the wild cabbage picture that you see, that's what we would be eating if plant breeders hadn't been doing all this, crossbreeding. So because of that wild cabbage and the advances within biotechnology and plant breeding in general, we have broccoli and kale and bok choy and all the wonderful foods that we see in our grocery store. Same thing with corn. You wouldn't recognize the sweet corn that you eat today based on the original corn that we had. It's been domesticated over time. Same thing with a basic carrot. So all of our food has been through genetic modification, and biotechnology, in fact, is nothing new. Next slide. So how GMOs are made, I'm actually going to make sure that people that are interested get a really great video on how GMOs are made, and there's a really fascinating example about papaya. So papaya, and I'll talk about the different crops that are GMOs that exist today. But papaya is one of those great examples, and there's a great video that I'd love to pass along to the teachers to be able to show their class about how GMOs are made. But another method, other than the one that's shown in the video with the papaya example, is one that was developed by a lady named Mary Del Chilton. She's actually an employee of Syngenta, I'm really proud to say. She's 76 years old today. We call her the queen of agrobacterium. She's still, when I go down and visit our U.S. facility, she still works in her lab, in her pink lab coat, and you go by and she's just going about her work. But what was the discovery that was so important to modern biotechnology? At the time, she was leading a team of scientists in Washington University that were studying, and if you look at the picture of a plant and it's got a bunch of tumor-looking things on it, she was studying a disease called crown gall disease. And basically, that's a cancer of plants, and all plants will get this. But as science sort of goes on and experiments happen, something very interesting when they were discovering that actual disease. They found then that there was a bacterium that was responsible for that disease. But not only that, that bacterium was inserting part of its DNA, tumor-inducing genes, into that plant, making the replication sort of happen. And so she was the one that said, oh my goodness, here we have a bacterium that is transferring genes into a plant. And so they were able to silence the genes that were responsible for the cancer-producing part of that bacteria, and it was called agrobacterium-mediated transfer of DNA. So that's a very commonly used method of how then researchers or scientists get that DNA, that blueprint of life, into another plant. And so they can get a particular trait that's responsible for disease resistance, put it into this agrobacterium, and then the bacterium infects that particular plant and it's incorporated into the DNA of that plant. So those are just a couple examples. So we've talked about some GMO basics. We've talked about what biotechnology is, how GMOs are made. Let's dive into a little bit more of biotechnology. So again, I have up on the screen there a number of the crops that exist today that have been altered through genetic modification. And those in red are the ones that we grow in Canada. So corn, canola, soybeans, and sugar beets. And then continuing on in the bottoms are ones that we would import into Canada based on GMOs that are produced in other parts of the world, like the US, or papaya, which is grown in Hawaii as well. So there's about 8 GMO crops that exist today. Next slide. So let's dive into the safety of biotech products, because again, I think in many cases, people are fearful of new technology. When they hear of biotechnology, even though you've learned today it's nothing new, our plants have been going through genetic modification since the beginning of time, but biotech products are safe. If that's the one thing I want you to sort of learn from today's lesson on GMOs, is that biotech products are safe. Canada has one of the safest food supplies in the world. I have a team of scientists within Syngenta that are just looking into all of the safety studies that go into Health Canada or to the Food Inspection Agency in Ottawa, and they then weed through those hundreds and hundreds of studies for their safety, for not only for humans but also for the environment. They have a tremendous food safety record, having been cultivated for well over a decade and eaten by billions of people around the world. Their safety has been endorsed by scientists around the world. And really, when people think about it, if you think about it from a Syngenta science perspective, we don't work in our labs producing GMOs and then they end up on the grocery shelves the next day. It takes about 13 years to bring a single genetically modified product to the market. So what happens in those 13 years? A lot of research, a lot of studies. How are they going to impact human health? Do they impact human health? Do they cause allergenicity? What are all the safety aspects of that? So you can be rest assured then when there is a GM product, and we talked about the 8 that are in North America approved, that they come with a tremendous safety record behind them as well. Next slide. So again, one of the big parts of that safety record is the government has to determine, are those 2 crops, so you've got, let's say, a GM corn product, and one has a particular trait that allows it to resist drought conditions, and the other one is a non-GM corn product. Those 2 corn products, we have to prove that they're, from a composition and nutritional standpoint, very much equal. And the government, again, looks through all those studies to determine that. So other than that one particular gene, those particular corn varieties are identical in all other aspects. Let's talk a bit about the benefits of GMOs. We always hear a lot of negative things about agriculture in the media today. So let's talk about some of those benefits when we think about what are some of the GM products that are being developed today. How about benefits for the environment? We have a lot of climate change going on. We have a lot of environmental conditions. Farmers can lose their crop of corn based on very drought-like conditions. So what about a GM drought-tolerant corn? Wouldn't that be of benefit to the environment then? What about corn seeds that require less nitrogen? So nitrogen-smart corn, a fertilizer then that can be costly to farmers and can have environmental impacts. So if we're able to reduce the environmental footprint of nitrogen, that would be an environmental benefit of GMOs. What about all the waste that happens? So I think someone told me the statistic about 50% of food is wasted just in the garbage alone. So think about some apple varieties, and there is an apple variety under development, which is undergoing testing and approval within the government systems. It's called the Arctic apple, and it doesn't undergo browning. So again, they've identified the gene that's responsible for that browning, and then been able to sort of replace that and make sure that that browning effect doesn't happen. So again, that would be reducing weight, very much a benefit. Food allergies. So when we talk about everyone that has peanut allergies, for instance, what if GM technology could take that protein that's responsible for allergies, that allergenic protein in peanuts, and replace that with a non-allergenic protein of identical quality, and being able to eliminate the life-threatening peanut allergies, but still be able to have a peanut product that would be healthy for the consumer. What about improving nutrition? So Syngenta actually has a product, and it's called Golden Rice, and it has beta-carotene in it to deliver vitamin A to children in developing nations. And again, that's where my perspective and Syngenta's perspective of agriculture is really global in nature. If you think about a product, and you have millions and millions of kids going blind every year because they don't have vitamin A in their diet, and their diet consists mostly of rice, if you're then able to deliver that beta-carotene into a rice variety, then that would be a really great thing for genetically modified technology. Pineapple with lycopene, and also omega-3 oils from canola oil, which have been scientifically proven to prevent heart disease. So lots of different benefits, improving nutrition. That should certainly be something that's of interest to the consumer. Let's talk a minute about why farmers use GMOs, okay? Again, their perspective, a farmer's perspective, is to be able to produce food for a very much a growing, hungry population. And Canada farmers are no different. They produce food for the world. Talk about being the biggest, exporters of wheat and pulse crops and canola. So basically, if you look at some of those pictures, farmers have a lot of their crop wiped out from weeds. And if you look at that picture of weeds, there is a soybean crop in there, but that's from a field that wouldn't have been treated with, it wouldn't have a genetically modified soybean, or it wouldn't have used a pesticide to control those weeds. Then in the middle there, that's a potato that would go on to produce the French fries that we all eat and love, but that's been devastated by late blight. And then if you look at the other picture of the insect, that's a Colorado potato beetle. And at the end of the season, again, that insect would actually devastate the crop. And there's actually no food left that could be harvested from that field. So farmers use it for a lot of reasons, but also from extreme weather conditions such as drought, to reduce the impact of agriculture on their environment. And then the example that I was going to show you through video, but it's not going to work on this particular technology, but really invite you to look at the devastation of the papaya in Hawaii. And there was one particular virus that was really close to extinction. And we actually have another example that's going to happen in Florida. The oranges are being threatened by citrus greening virus. And without a solution, although researchers are now looking at a GM solution, that crop is certainly going to be devastated. And orange juice, quite frankly, is going to disappear from the shelves off our grocery stores. So I'm going to get to questions. This is kind of my last slide, but I'm going to have you guys at the end of the day have a little challenge to put out to you all, is to, based on some of the things that you've learned today, wondered if you could come up with a product of modern day biotechnology. So don't worry about thinking about one that's going to work. Just dream, really think outside the box, think innovation, think about what the possibilities could be from biotechnology. But here's one that I just found from the from the news, and one that's right in our own backyards here: cancer-fighting purple tomatoes harvested in Leamington. So it's in that very early stages of what I say of that 13-year process to go through that it takes GM crops to make it to the marketplace. But basically, that's a really innovative story around biotechnology. So if we move to my last slide, I think we're going to move to some questions, but I have provided some additional resources for teachers. And then maybe at the end, when we're done with some questions, I have a couple of little homework things. I know everyone loves homework. So I thought I'd pass around a couple homework things that then you can feed back to us, talk about what you've learned, and then I will know I will have learned a lot from today as well. So with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Brent to sort of facilitate the Q&A session.
All right. Thank you so much, Nancy. We're just going to rearrange some of our technology here and make sure that we can see everybody in the classrooms. So we're going to try and get to some questions. I'd like to start with Ms. Cappadocia's class and ask if there's somebody who would like to volunteer a question for Nancy. We have a question from North Bay.
Lots of thinking going on. There's lots of information to digest.
All right.
There's no crazy question. Don't forget.
Okay, we have a hand. Go ahead.
If the apples don't brown, how will you know when they're gone bad?
That's the thing. So browning is not necessarily because that there's a disease. So there's two types of browning, right? One is just a browning due to the shelf life, and one is a browning due to the spoilage of the product. So the example that I gave is not one that has any disease-associated risk. Those are sort of two separate initiatives that are going on in the apple. One is just over time, the apples get bruised. Many of you see that. I know apples in my crisper get a bruise or they're bumped around in their transportation. So it's really that sort of browning that the researchers are looking to prevent. Then that would someone say, oh, that's brown, it's bad. Well, no, actually it's not. But the process for it, there was actually a disease going on in the apple, and it was truly maybe not safe to eat because it had a bacterial or a fungal infection. That would still happen. So great question.
Thanks, Nancy. We're going to go to our Twitter stream and ask if we have a question from Twitter.
Mm-hmm. So one question that we have from Twitter for Nancy is, how many crops are grown as GMOs in Ontario?
Oh, Ontario. So the list that I gave for Canada was 4, right? So we've got corn, soybeans, canola, and what was my last one? Testing you guys now. But in Ontario, we absolutely have corn, genetically modified corn, and genetically modified soybeans, and genetically modified canola. So all 3 of those for sure are in Ontario. So again, but if you think about the products that end up in your shelves, corn produces a lot of different products. So it's not just the sweet corn that you eat. It would be processed foods like cornflakes, and all different kinds of corns. Corn that ends up as high fructose corn syrup that ends up in all of our pop and things like that. So those are the types of crops, of GM crops that are currently, there's certainly lots under development that have to go through that process of approval, but that's currently what I would say we have existing in Ontario today.
Thanks, Nancy. Maybe we can ask our host class if there's somebody that has a question in the room. Go ahead.
Is it true that there's fish DNA and tomatoes?
No, so again, look at all those list of things. Is tomato even on the list of genetically modified foods? So again, I think what's important to understand about that kind of a question is there have been many products of GM under development, and then lots of very scary information put out there into the media. And that's where, again, I think we have a population of people that have become scared of their food. So again, if the headline is fish DNA put into a tomato, that sounds very, very scary. But again, if you think about on the basic level of we all have DNA, it's all producing, the same sort of blueprint of life. And at the end of the day, the products are tested by the government to make sure that nothing has changed from a plant's perspective. So the short answer is no, but I sort of wanted to sort of dive into, what's wrong with, sort of spreading misinformation about, some of the current products that are out there. Some of you may have also heard General Mills came out with a statement not too long ago is that they're going GMO free with their Cheerios. Did anyone sort of maybe make that connection? What are Cheerios made of? Can I have a shout out for Mr. Geitch's class? What are Cheerios made of? No.
Awesomeness.
Oats.
Awesome.
They're made of oats. Was oats on my list of GMO products on the screen? No. So what was that statement? Marketing. It's marketing. And again, it's marketing to a population that's become afraid of technology and their food and things like that. So I know you folks are all going to grow up in a world where very much science-based, and you're going to put your science lens on everything. And certainly that's what I'm hoping after today's lesson too, is that you always dive into GM. Just because someone comes out and says something, let's look at the body of evidence that's out there. We use that something in the science world called a weight of evidence approach. And just because one person comes out and says one thing negative about GM, or even one study shows something negative, let's look at the hundreds or thousands of studies that have been done on GM products and then make an educated decision based on that.
Fabulous. Let's go back to North Bay. Is there another question in Ms. Cappadocia's class? All right, I don't see anybody volunteering, so let's go back to the Twittersphere.
Yep, so we have another question coming in on Twitter from Mrs. Kirkby's class at Munden Park. And their question is, can you tell them a little bit more about neonics and how that relates to GMOs and crops in Ontario?
Yeah, and thanks to Mrs. Kirkby's class for going on Twitter and talking about the event. I actually saw you at your computer desk yesterday typing the questions, and I could very blurry see question for Dr. Tout. So neonics, it's not really related to the topic of GMOs, but very, very briefly, neonics are a product, another tool. So again, when we think about feeding 9 billion people by 2050, there's various tools to be able to do that. One of them is GM that we've talked about today. And another one is seed treatment products that we put on the seed to protect them from mainly disease and insects. And so a neonic is an insecticide that would protect the seed from insect attack. And so bees, if you look at neonics and bees and all that's been put out in the media, I think it's important to recognize that we're all interested in bee health. And like any science discipline that you guys take in your science classes, it's pretty complex, right? So bee health is affected by a number of different factors. The predominant one actually being a destructive mite called the varroa mite, which then brings in disease and things like that. So I'll very briefly say bee health is impacted by a number of different factors, and certainly we all need to sort of work together to figure that out. But actually bee colonies across Canada are actually on the rise.
Fabulous. Is there another question in the room? Go ahead.
Is it possible to make like half an orange, half apple? Like, can you combine stuff?
Wow. So
it's
like the 2-for-1 fruit and veggie deal. So the question came in is, could we have half orange and half apple? So I think you win the prize already for the most innovative GMO product, which I'm going to ask everyone to do. But technically, I think, when you think about what's of interest to the consumer, ultimately the consumer will decide what GM products are brought to market. Syngenta and other companies have brought different GM products, whether that's a herbicide-tolerant corn or an insect-resistant corn, to market because there's a true need for that technology, right? So certainly if in the future there's a need to people to have both an orange and an apple, then I think ultimately the consumer gets to decide whether those products are under development, because a company is not going to spend $200 million to produce one product and take 13 years doing that with all of its research and science if ultimately in the end the consumer is not interested in it.
So we're already over time, so we're going to take one more question from Twitter, and then we will get out of here.
All right. So I have a question coming in from a student. His name's Hassan, and his question is, do GMOs need pesticides to be able to work as a crop?
Yes, some GM products or some GM crops would need. So for instance, some of the first biotechnology products were made have that benefit that we talked about. Why do farmers use GMO technology? And so one of them is a herbicide tolerant, whether that's a herbicide tolerant corn plant or a herbicide tolerant canola plant. Then what that means then is that when that farmer sprays that crop, the weeds are going to be killed. So they're not going to have that picture that I showed of the soybean of all those weeds coming up. They're not going to have that competition from the weeds. But that crop is going to remain healthy. So yes, there are some products on the market, some GM products that have a herbicide tolerant trait or an insecticide herbicide or resistant trait, then that would require the application of a pesticide over top of that.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to thank Ontario Agri-Food Education for partnering with Partners in Research today for this PIR live event.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Gaitch's class, I'd like to thank Ms. Cappadocia's class, and also like to thank all of our viewers on the live event stream today. Thank you for watching. And most of all, I'd like to thank Nancy for sharing her vast area of knowledge in this field. Thank you so much, Nancy.
It was my pleasure. Lots of fun.
Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you on PIR live event for the next one. Thank you.